What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode / video. I am not sure exactly if this is just going to be for YouTube or YouTube podcast, most likely the latter, just because it's more in depth than what most of my YouTube videos will be. So I am probably, like I usually do with my podcasts, going to post it on audio and then post it on video. But my first idea was making this into a YouTube video. I just think it's going to be a little bit long. So either way, it will be on YouTube, just maybe in podcast form. Almost think of it as a podcast. So it'll be more conversational. It won't be quite as streamlined, but it'll be definitely very comprehensive. And today's topic is going to be on rucking. So essentially what it is I'm going to break down what I would do if I really wanted to be excellent at rucking about a year from now. Of course, very hypothetical, and the concepts will apply whether you need to be good at rucking kind of soon or whether you need to be good at rucking in a year or 2 years or whatever it is. But to give it a little bit of a framework, it's going to be how I would plan out 1 year of ruck training to get good at rucking. And specifically, I'm talking about not just being really good at rucking one time. So say you have like a 12 miler. If you do a bunch of the things that I'm going to talk about early on in this episode, you can get to where you are very much ready to go and smash a 12 miler with very minimal rucking. But I'm going to talk about why it is very important not to just do bare minimum rucking like some programs and philosophies will lead you to believe if you're going to selection, and that selection is going to be day after day after day of rucking. There's a big durability component. So I'm going to get into that. What I'm going to do is just break down some of the training specific considerations and the recovery and specificity considerations of developing your rucking ability. And I'm going to break it down from what I would focus on from 12 months out to 6 months out to when you have to go smash, whether it's a selection or whatever it is, 6 months out to 3 months out, and then 3 months out until go time or until you're going into a taper before you show up to selection. So before we get into each little category today, why would you listen to me? Well, I am not very good at many things, but I have always been really good at rucking, especially when I train for it. And although a lot of these things that I'm about to tell you, I didn't know what I know now when I prepped for these rucks, I still knew enough and I still kept it specific enough where I was able to put up some pretty impressive, what other people would consider impressive ruck times relative to what guys around me were doing. So for example, my 12-mile ruck PR with 45 pounds dry, it was probably about 55 pounds. This was during the Q course back in 2013, was an hour and 37 minutes, which is an 8:06 pace. So pretty quick. My 18-mile ruck PR is 2 hours and 38 minutes. And that occurred at a selection where they do an 18-mile ruck on the first day. I don't know exactly what it was down to the second because I had a Timex watch and we kind of like started staggered, but it was about 2 hours, 38 minutes in a kind of snow ice storm and lots of uphill, downhill. And it was at nighttime too. So that was, I think that's like an 8:45 pace or 8:43 pace or something along those lines. So I definitely have a decent amount of natural ability for rucking, but I also train for it what I consider pretty well, despite the fact that I didn't have all the knowledge that I have today. But that being said, that doesn't mean you should listen to me. Just because someone is good at something does not mean they know how to make other people good at something. And that's something that that's a disconnect between what a lot of people think, like, oh, I should listen to this influencer because they're really good at what they do. They're really fit. They're really strong. They're really fast, whatever it is. Over this coach who may not be as good looking or may not have as nice content or may not be as good at marketing or may not be as popular, but is really, really good at helping other people like you do what they do. So even though I have some impressive ruck times, I won 1 out of the 2 rucks during gate week. Other ruck, I came in second, the shorter of the 2 at SFAS, and I won the CAG selection 18-miler by a good probably 7 to 10 minutes. That doesn't mean necessarily that you should listen to me because I know what I'm talking about. But I do help a lot of people, and I have been helping a lot of people prep for these selections as well. So even if you are not a genetically gifted rucker, which, like I said, I'm not really that good at a lot of things, but I've always been a pretty solid runner relative to other people in the military, of course, not relative to actual really good runners, elite runners, competitive runners. I've always been a solid rucker, and I've always had a decent deadlift randomly because I just am built well for it, and I really like that lift. Of course, I train it a lot because usually we train what we enjoy. But other than that, I don't really have anything all that impressive. I can't do a ton of pull-ups. I can't do a ton of push-ups compared to other guys. I'm just pretty good at rucking and running. But this is, of course, a rucking episode. So, oh, and by the way, my worst ever 12 miler was 2 hours and 7 minutes. And that took place at Ranger School. Anyone who's been knows that when you go into that ruck, it's on like day 5 and you're just completely smoked and underfed. And it's not the best conditions for performance. So my worst ever ruck, 2:07, pretty damn fast. A lot of people would love to put up a 2:20 12-mile ruck. A lot of people would love to put up a 2:30 12-mile ruck. So we're going to get into how to do that today, but just giving you a little bit of a background on my rucking ability. And then also I am helping multiple guys prep for selection as we speak. And I have helped multiple guys successfully prep for selection. There have been some clients, I'm going to get into kind of why this is important later on in the episode, but I have had a couple clients when they first start working with me, or a good handful of clients that are quite unskilled at rucking. We're talking like not even able to hit the 3-hour, 12-mile ruck standard that you have to be no slower than in order to basically be in SOF, let alone make it through selection. You want to be faster than that. I'll get into kind of what you should be shooting for here in a bit. But they've gone from there to finishing top 20% in the gates at selection. Of course, not over like a month or two. This is over 6+ months. And I've had guys, when they first start working with me, walk 17, 30, 18-minute miles. And by the time they're done working with me, they're walking, not just running or going as fast as they can on a ruck, but just walking only sub 13-minute miles. So 4 or 5 minutes off their walking pace. And I have helped several one-on-one clients, as well as probably well over 100 other people prep for selection by proxy using my programs. And if you're interested in a program, I've got some in the description. But anyway, that's kind of why you should listen to me. Of course, I've been studying human physiology, exercise science, nutrition, with a bias towards soft selection prep, hybrid training for quite a while. So I feel like I have developed enough of a skill set, enough experience, and enough social proof that what I'm about to say is probably something you should at least take into account. Maybe not do every single thing that I'm about to say, but, at least use it to guide your training and guide your approach. So this is going to be very, very simple. None of this is going to be complicated at all. I think people try and reinvent the wheel with certain styles of training. And just because rucking is a very uncommon, like not a lot of people are looking to run 12 miles or 18 miles or however long they're looking to go with a 45, 50, 60 pound backpack on a regular basis. It's just not very common. So it doesn't really get talked about that much. I did some YouTube searching a little bit earlier, and there definitely are some videos on rucking, but they're pretty simple and kind of vanilla, and I don't agree with everything that's in them. And I'm not saying that everything I say is right and what everyone else says is wrong, but I'm going to offer some comprehensive. It's not going to be super down to like the sets, reps, exact mileage, exact paces or anything like that, because there's so much variance in that depending on the person. But I'll talk about strength training, I'll talk about run training, I'll talk about ruck training, and I'll talk about reverse engineering what makes up someone who is really good at rucking. So, and again, I'll break it into those month by month or quarter by quarter increments. So let's first talk about specificity, which I talk about ad nauseum on my shows, on my Instagram posts, on my YouTube. But the weird, a little bit unique thing about rucking is specificity is not quite as critical as certain other things. Like if you want to get really good at running and you do a bunch of biking, you're not going to get that good at running. You're going to build your aerobic fitness, but you're not going to dominate running because it's very specific. You have to make specific adaptations to it. Rucking's a little different where, like I said earlier, if you want to just go and put up a really good ruck time one time, you have a 12 miler, say 3 months from now, and you are a very good runner, you have an excellent running base, and you're super strong, just full body strength, there's a pretty good chance you'll be able to put up a really good ruck time. When I was in group, I did not ruck all that much later in my career, and every so often we would have to do a 12 miler. And just from my running base and my strength base, I was able to go and finish around 2 hours, give or take, on most of them. That's with 0 ruck training. Now, I was completely destroyed afterwards. My body was super beat up, which is why it's really important to, if you are prepping for something that's going to require back-to-back days of rucking or weeks of rucking, like any selection or ranger school, whatever it is. Ranger school a little different, but you get the picture. Then you need to do specific ruck training. But to be good one-time performance, not quite as important. Of course, if I had done rucking, if I had trained rucking for those later in my career events, I would have finished faster. But it just goes to show that you can be a pretty solid runner and have a decent amount of strength and still do pretty well under a ruck one time. But if you want repeat performances, you got to actually prepare for it, and that's what I'll get into. So let's reverse engineer rucking. What are the components, the subcomponents that make up someone who is really good at rucking? So, of course, like any physical trait and any physical capability and any really capability in existence, whether it's exercise or not, genetics are a big factor. They do play a role. I'm sorry, they just do. Generally speaking, guys who are better at rucking are a little bit taller, which makes sense. You got longer limbs, you can take longer strides, and so you don't have to have quite as high of a cadence in order to ruck pretty fast. Generally, guys who are solid at rucking are a little bit bigger, not necessarily like super crazy jacked, although I have seen some guys that are not very good at running. They're a little slower, say on a 5 mile, maybe barely beating that 40-minute standard, but they absolutely smash rucking. It oftentimes, guys who are good at running are also good ruckers, but sometimes guys aren't as good at running, but they're pretty damn good ruckers. And usually those guys are well over 6 feet tall, pretty good size, maybe former football players that have done a little bit of endurance since then to kind of build that staying power. But it doesn't necessarily compute 1-to-1. On the flip side, some guys are a lot skinnier and weaker, but they're great runners. That is kind of a recipe for not potentially being that great at rucking because of the added weight. So I've seen guys who are like elite runners. I'm talking like mid 20-minute 5 miles. That's not quite elite, but for the Army, it's very, very fast, or the military, it's very fast. But because they're so skinny, maybe they have like a very extensive running background and they haven't done enough strength training. They haven't built enough strength that when you put that extra 50, 60 pounds on their back, they really struggle and they don't have the ability to move anywhere near as fast as they can without a ruck on, or for anywhere near as long without a ruck on. And they break down very easily. So back to genetics, of course, if you have a decent amount of slow twitch muscle fibers and you have great natural endurance and you are not crazy weak, which is not purely genetics, but there's genetic factors in all that, and you can recover really well, especially usually guys with slower twitch muscle fibers or higher percentage of slower twitch muscle fibers genetically just recover faster. You're set up to be potentially a very good rucker, especially with some really good training. So keep that in mind, but also sometimes guys who are shorter and naturally not quite as genetically gifted for rucking can still be excellent ruckers. I've seen some guys 5'5", 5'6" that absolutely smash under 2 hour 12 milers, no problem. Of course, not just by not doing anything. They train for it, they prep for it, they're in very, very good shape, and they work hard. They overcome these potential genetic limitations to crush under a ruck, but I've seen it. It's a real thing. So a lot of times shorter guys, short kings, will give themselves this kind of narrative, this self-limiting belief where like, oh, I'm just genetically predisposed to not being very good at rucking, so I'm just going to kind of ride that and not try and overcome it. And that's no way to go about it. So may not be beating someone who's 6 feet tall, 6'1", and a former Division I runner that has since put on a bunch of muscle and strength. You might not beat them in a 12-mile ruck, but you can at least put up a significantly better time than you can now, and you can at least crush the standards. So don't have that self-limiting belief. Yes, you're at a disadvantage, but it's not a death sentence. The next one is nurture. So you have nature, genetics, you got nurture, your upbringing, your background. What have you been doing most of your life before you start getting into rucking? Are you a non-athlete? Have you not played any sports growing up and you have to kind of build your general fitness from the ground up, bootstrap it? Or have you been a strength power athlete growing up and you don't really have a lot of endurance? Don't worry, you can build endurance and you have a pretty good foundation of strength, whereas someone else may be the opposite, where they grew up playing endurance sports or doing endurance sports and they don't really have much strength, so they need to build that. Ideally, you're kind of a combination between both. You have decent genetics, you got solid upbringing with a little bit of mix of different sports, and you've kind of, over time, since you stopped playing your sport, decided to pursue a selection that involves rucking. You've built a decent amount of fitness that will carry over to your rucking, and I'll kind of talk about specifics as we go throughout this episode. The next one that is a big factor, reverse engineering, remember, nature, nurture, running endurance. The ability to run well is another huge factor. Like I said, if you've been running a lot, you have a big running background, you have great running genetics, you're naturally inclined to potentially be very good at rucking. And lastly, strength, full body strength, especially lower body, your glutes, your quads, your hamstrings, even your lower legs, just for durability's sake, like the ability to continue to subject your body to the impact that is a result of rucking is huge. But also upper body strength is still very important. So generally, like guys with really strong posterior chains, hamstrings, glutes, lower back, upper back, lats, traps are going to be at a bigger advantage for rucking as opposed to guys who have like, all they do is arm day, chest day, and quad day. So if you have a solid base of lower and upper body strength and you are a solid runner, you have the raw materials to be a good rucker. And like I said, if you're just rucking once, that's really all you need. Not ideal. You probably want to do some specific rucking, even if you're just doing it one time, so you're not beat up or you don't hurt yourself. But you probably can put up a random ruck time if you get like short notice on a 12-mile ruck or something like that. You'll be able to do pretty well. And the next one, number 4, is pain tolerance. If you can endure pain, no matter what, rucking is going to be uncomfortable. So if you're just starting out rucking, it's going to be uncomfortable because you're not going to be used to it. Think of it as any other discipline that you try out. Running, when you first start, it's not going to be super enjoyable. It's not going to be very comfortable because you're just not used to it. You're not accustomed to it. But the better you get at it, just like running, rucking's the same. Better you get at it, the harder you're going to be able to go. And the more fatiguing and the more it's going to take out of you to go as hard as you can and put up your best times, your best performances. So it's still going to be painful either way. But one advantage to doing it very frequently and getting really good at it is your pain tolerance will increase because you're just more accustomed to it. You've just been in that situation more often. It's just like anything else, like something that you're really uncomfortable with right now. You could absolutely continue to expose yourself to that time after time after time after time. And over time, yes, it'll still hurt, but the way you perceive it will change because you're just more used to it. Your body is just more used to it. Your mind is more used to it. And that's a huge important factor. And then lastly is specificity, not because it's the least important, but because we're reverse engineering, right? So we have all those 4 concepts before we get into specificity. And when you have all those 4 concepts, high pain tolerance, great running ability, full body strength, nature, nurture, can't do anything about genetics, but you can maximize your own genetics. Then you add in rucking specificity, so specific ruck-based training, and you are creating a perfect environment to put up your best ruck times. So lastly, before we get into the plan and what we're actually going to be focusing on, let's talk about the differences between ruck running and rucking, because I consider them 2 completely different forms of training because of the effect they have on your body and when you should do each of them and when you should not do each of them. And I'll talk about specifics here in a bit. Ruck walking is a much more appropriate for all people type of modality. So for example, my mother, Ruck, she puts a weighted vest on and she goes for walks. It's not heavy. She doesn't go out and try and walk as fast as humanly possible. She's not running with it on. She's just putting 10 to 12 pounds in a weighted vest or a little backpack, and it adds a little bit of stimulus to it. A lot of people argue that rucking is worse for you or higher impact or more likely to injure you than running, and that is not the case. Unless you're ruck running, then it's different. Ruck running is when you're trying to get your fastest time you possibly can. You show up to selection. It's gate week. You have a ton of people that are competing over getting selected. Of course, you're not competing necessarily. There's standards. You got to meet them or you don't meet them. If you don't meet them, you're not going to make it. Doesn't matter how many people in that class make it versus don't. Could be 10 people, could be 110 people. But you are still going to feel a little bit like it's a competition when you're out there. So you want to, and even if it wasn't a competition, you still want to put up your best time you possibly can, regardless of what selection you're at. So in order to do so, it benefits you to ruck run. However, ruck running is a lot more impactful. It's a lot more stressful on the body. It's a lot higher likelihood that you're going to get hurt. So it must be done with caution. It must be trained very intentionally and only during certain periods of time. Ruck walking, you can pretty much ruck walk all the time. There are plenty of people who ruck walk every single day. Now, of course, they vary their volume, they vary their load, they vary their speed, their intensity, but it can very well be done. I wouldn't start just all of a sudden doing it every single day if you don't ruck at all, but you can work your way up to that. Ruck running, not the same. Think about running. A lot of people get hurt running. It's very, very common to see running injuries, mostly from overuse, mostly from either doing too much too soon, poor form, really bad programming, whatever it is. Add 50 pounds to your back and then run. And what do you think that does to the injury risk? Obviously, it's going to bring it up. So there's other forms of running besides like running as fast as you possibly can with a ruck. There's shuffling, there's trotting. Here's the deal. A lot of people will ask, okay, so you say ruck walk most of the time, and then you say when you're getting close to a selection process, that's when you can do your ruck running. What about shuffling? What about trotting? Shuffling and trotting, and I'm just going to group those into the same category. You're not running as fast as you can, but you're also not walking. You're kind of going at a slightly faster pace than walking and a slightly slower pace than running. And you're also doing like shorter strides. It's less impactful than ruck running, for sure, but it's not the same as walking. You're going to beat yourself up less if you learn how to walk. And here's the thing about ruck walking is almost everyone doesn't practice it the way that I recommend practicing it. Most guys, they go out and they either do a ruck walk where they walk at a nice leisurely pace, nice and comfortable, or they go out and they do walk runs, or they actually train like ruck running, ruck trotting. They don't actually try to walk fast. And this is like a little known, it should be like pretty duh, but a lot of people don't really know about it. Getting your ruck walking pace faster is massively important. One, it'll allow you to train at faster paces without running, so it'll still be lower impact. It'll still be less stressful on your body, even though you're going faster. Two, if you develop the ability to walk really fast, even if you're at selection, say, and you're doing land nav, or you're doing something where you don't necessarily have to go balls to the wall, like you're not doing a gate, but you have a ruck on, and speed still does matter a little bit. Every minute counts when you're out on the land nav course. If you're going balls to the wall as fast as you can, but just still walking with a ruck on, if your max pace is, say, 17-minute miles or 16-minute miles, because you never practice it, when you're out there preserving energy on the land nav course, you're probably going to be going 20-minute miles, 22-minute miles, 23-minute miles. Whereas if someone else's max walking pace is 13 minutes per mile, which is very doable, by the way, with practice and consistency, their preserve energy pace might be your max walking speed pace, 17 minutes, 18 minutes per mile. Think about how much that'll add up over 12 hours of land nav, where again, every second counts. So getting that walk pace up has multiple different benefits. The ability to have a fast max speed so that your preserve energy speed is also faster. And also it allows you to train at higher intensities without running. And therefore you can train more, you can do more volume, you can spend more time with a ruck on, and also at a lower fatigue cost and a lower potential injury risk. So very important. I'll talk about specific ways to do it here and when you should do it. So with that out of the way, let's get into what I would do if hypothetically today I was 1 year out from starting selection. Like I said, apply this to yourself. Most likely no one is 1 year out from starting selection. You might be a little more, you might be a little less, but just kind of use your critical thinking skills, common sense, and kind of go from there. And if you have questions about this, by the way, ask them in the comments and I will happily answer. So we're going to consider this a support phase. And then we're also going to consider the fact that you at least have a somewhat decent general fitness base. Not like you're about to peak and go to selection, not like you're an absolute freak stud and you don't really need to do much prep for selection other than like maybe 6 weeks where you start doing a little bit more specific training. But there are guys like that can just show up at the drop of a dime and crush. But we're going to just break this down as if you have a solid fitness base, but you need to build a running base. And then you also need to, in the future, be really good at running and rucking at the same time, which is the case for most selections. So for each of these categories, I'm going to break them down into a few subcategories. I'm going to talk about running training. I'm going to talk about lifting. I'm going to talk about cross training, and I'm going to talk about rucking. So that's 4 different training categories. So this is going to be called the base phase. You're going to be building your base here. And in running and other endurance sports, there are generally a few different phases. So you have the base phase where you build your base of fitness. Then you have your support phase where you kind of transfer from the base phase into a more higher intensity phase. So you have your base built and then you go a little higher intensity, but it's not quite specific. It's a little less specific, more general. And then you have your race prep or specific race prep phase. And that's where we're going to kind of split these into. So 12 to 6 months out is going to be our base phase. If you want to hear more about specifically run base building, go ahead and check out episode 95. That's on audio only, by the way, not video. Spotify, Apple Podcasts. I talk about building a running base. But I'm going to briefly touch on it here and in the context of the subject of the show, which is rucking. So your running is going to take place 3 to 4 days per week. And you're going to start out, assuming you don't really have much of a running base, but you have a decent general fitness base. Apply this as you see fit. If you already have a pretty solid running base, then you can maybe skip this phase or maybe have a combination between the base phase and the support phase. But we're going to just pretend that you're building a running base kind of from the ground up, but you are somewhat fit in general. So 3 to 4 runs a week. All these runs are going to be easy runs and 1 long run. So you're going to do, say, for example, you're just starting out. Maybe you do 3 15-minute runs throughout the week, and then you do a 20-minute long run on the weekend. That does not seem long, but if you're just starting out, that might be what it looks like. If you have been running a little bit, maybe it's 3 40-minute runs throughout the week, and then a long run of 60 minutes, something like that. And you're going to slowly over time add volume to that. Generally, I just recommend adding 5 minutes per run per week. Or if you're just adding to your long run, just add 10 minutes. So for example, if you do 3 20-minute runs and a 40-minute run one week, the next week you could either do 4 runs, 25 for 3 of them, and then 45 for the long run. Or you could stick to 20 for the weekday or easy runs, and then add 10 minutes and do a 50-minute long run. I don't like to add quite as much time to a single run just because it's a little bit more of a stressor. It's more of a potential injury risk than spreading that out. But generally speaking, that's what it'll look like. After one of your runs, you should do something like hill strides. On a slight incline, you go up to like an endurance running pace, fast endurance running pace, not a full sprint, for 20 to 30 seconds. Start with like 4 reps, maybe work your way up to 6 to 8 reps. After another run throughout the week, or you could do this on a separate day, or you could even do this before one of your runs. That's probably what I recommend in general, is doing it before a run. You could do it after a run too, after an easy run, not after a long run, is hill sprints. And I don't mean hill repeats like endurance hill repeats. I mean like hill sprints, like all out hill sprints, but they're going to be very short, 8 to 10 seconds, long rest periods. They should not feel like cardio. You should be resting plenty in between. You should be calling on the ATP PC energy system, very short, fast, low endurance. And the main purpose of this is to build your fast twitch muscle fibers. Running is endurance in general on your feet. Running, rucking is a slow twitch activity, but that does not mean fast twitch muscle fibers are not important. And because you're going to be doing so much slow running, you're going to get some fast twitch muscle fiber development from your lifting, which I'll talk about here in a second, but also you want to consider getting them specifically for running, getting that adaptation specifically for running. So maybe you start with like 4, and this should be on a relatively steep hill. If you can find a pretty damn steep hill, like max out the treadmill if you're doing it on a treadmill, but ideally even steeper than that, 15-20% incline if you have like a Nordic track, boom. Or if you can find a hill outside. And again, this is short. So one example may be you do maybe a 5 to 10 minute warm-up run, you find a hill, maybe you do 2 or 3 somewhat hard but not quite max effort, maybe RPE 6, 8, and then 9, and then you get into your sprints. And maybe you're just starting out, so you do 4 of them. 4, 10 seconds, balls to the wall, stop and walk back down, and then you're resting probably at least 2 to 3 minutes, maybe even 4 minutes, maybe even 5 minutes. You don't want to be out of breath when you start that next one. You basically want all of these sprints to be the same speed. So if you are not resting long enough, or if you're going way too long and you're turning it into more of an endurance session, not useless, but also just more fatiguing than stimulative. We want high stimulus, and if high fatigue comes with that, that's okay, but this is going to be a lot less fatiguing because you're resting a lot longer. And you do it on a hill mainly because it's safer. The hill has a lot of built-in mechanisms that make it safer. It will shorten your stride a little bit. It will slow you down inherently. And it also is lower impact because your foot is landing higher than the normal running surface if you're running on flat. That doesn't mean if you are not experienced with sprinting on flat that you can't do that, but generally I prefer the hill. Or if you don't have good access to hills, maybe you live in Florida and you don't really have any desire to do it on a treadmill, that's fine. If you have some sort of turf field or turf surface in your gym, maybe something like that, take a sled, don't put any weight on it, and just consider that a hill sprint. So you're literally putting your hands up against the posts and you're sprinting as fast as you can against the sled. It's not going to be a ton of resistance, but it's enough resistance to slow you down and make it safer and give it a solid challenge. So that's what your running is going to look like. Again, progressively building. Strength training, also 3 to 4 days a week. If you're weaker, if you're on the weaker side, maybe 4 days a week. If you are already pretty damn strong, probably 3 days a week. You can either do upper lower. If you're doing 4 days a week, you can do 3 times full body sessions. You could do upper lower full. You could do full upper lower. Split does not matter all that much. A lot of people put a lot of stock into split. And so long as you're training each muscle group, I would say twice a week, and you're hitting the big fundamental movement patterns, the squat, the hinge, the press, vertical and horizontal, the pull, vertical and horizontal, and you're doing some carries and you're doing some calisthenics, just general calisthenics. You don't have to get super specific yet for like selection, but as long as you're doing that, you're good. And you are focusing on progressive overload. You're focusing on getting stronger. Whether you like to train with RPE, RIR, percentages, whatever it is, it should be some sort of progressive overload. And you also want to consider, especially for lower body, And especially for your compound lifts, keep the rep range a little bit lower, probably 3 to 8 rep range for the most part. You can definitely do some isolation movements that are higher reps. You can occasionally go a little higher reps. The main reason you don't want to go crazy high reps with lower body is, one, it's just more fatiguing. So if you ever have done like 3 sets of 20 back squats to 1 or 2 reps in the tank, you have probably experienced just how destroyed you are after a session like that. Whereas if you do 3 sets of 5, even though you're going to be using more weight and you're still going the same intensity, the same proximity to failure, because it's so many fewer reps, you don't have to focus as long. It's safer. Generally speaking, it is actually safer to do 3x5 than it is 320. Of course, there are definitely nuances to that, and it does depend, but you have to focus for a lot shorter period of time, and you're not going to be quite as destroyed after a session like that, and it's not going to interfere as much with your running and your rucking and your just overall well-being. So I would keep those rep ranges, again, 3 to 8. Definitely sometimes can venture lower than that, sometimes higher than that, depending on the lift, but for the most part, that's what we want to focus on. I would also, at least once a week, do some sled work and carries. And when you think sled work, think more endurance style sled work than strength. So one really good way to get better at resistance walking, which is pretty much rucking, except do so in a way that's less impact, is to attach a sled to yourself. Whether you have a turf field, whether you just have a long path or trail, you can just attach a sled, or even a tire. If you don't have a sled, you can just attach a tire to you. What I do, I have a sled from Titan Fitness. I think it was like $65, not that bad. And I go out on my path behind the house. I have a very nice setup for this. I know not everyone does, but it's basically like 0.75 miles down and back. And it's a sand path, and I'd only put a little bit of weight on it because it gathers sand as I go and it builds up. But I just walk. I usually go out and walk for like an hour, sometimes 90 minutes. And it's a really, really good cardio stimulus. It's very low fatigue. It's acutely fatiguing. You're going to feel tired. It's going to feel very hard, but recovery wise, because there's no eccentric component, you're not actually doing a lowering portion of a movement, and you're going light and you're going long. It's more of a cardio stimulus than anything else. And it'll just get you really good at walking for a long period of time when your legs are under fatigue, which is similar to a ruck, but the difference is it's not impactful. So the ruck is very impactful, and there is an eccentric component, and it causes a lot more muscle damage. So that's going to kind of give you not necessarily a replacement for rucking, but it's going to help you build that fitness getting into your rucking. And speaking of which, let's talk about ruck training. How much do you need to ruck right now? Really not that much. I would say once a week, or maybe even 3 times a month. For some people, if you already know you're a pretty strong rucker, probably every other week. You can do 2 rucks a month. At this time too, you don't want to be going like exactly what the weight that you're going to be using at selection. So something in the 30 to 45 pound range. I would start light and work your way up. When you're rucking, you can increase or you can progress using multiple different variables. So you can either go longer, you can just walk for a longer period of time, same weight, same speed. You can go faster, where you go the same distance, same load, but you just walk faster. You can add load, where you walk the same pace, you go the same distance, and you add 5 pounds or 2.5 pounds, whatever it is. So there's no perfect way to progress every single week. Like, it doesn't really matter all that much. I would get to where at the end of this phase, when you're 6 months out, I would get to where you got 45 pounds in there, maybe up to 50 for some people, depending on your size, but you don't really need to go higher than 45 at this stage. And what I would do is start maybe with like a 45-minute ruck, maybe a 50-minute ruck, and add 5 minutes every week. And then maybe every few weeks, you add another 2.5 pounds. And over time, you don't necessarily have to focus on this. I like to just let this happen as it comes to me. Just get a little faster, walk a little bit faster over time. It's naturally going to happen because you're just going to get more used to it. But you don't necessarily have to be like, oh, last week I walked 15:30 paces. This week I have to walk 15:25. If I go any faster than that, I'm screwed. Or if I go any slower than that, that means I'm not making progress. I would just let that happen naturally. Now, of course, you want to get to where, if you possibly can, if you can start your 6 months out support phase, which I'll talk about the details of it here in a second, able to walk around a 15-minute mile, you're doing really well. And some guys will be way faster than that if you actually just practice it and stay consistent with it. Now, there are certain scenarios where you could do a little bit more frequent rucking. Maybe when you're 6 to 7 months out, you can up that to like once a week, where you do 1 ruck every single week or 4 rucks a month. That's fine too. But for now, honestly, you probably just are totally fine doing 2 per month or 3 per month, or maybe once a week, but only if you're a really weak rucker and or you're a really strong runner. but a weak rucker and you want to replace like your longer runs with rucks. That's another good option. When you are doing these rucks, I want you to think about a couple secondary goals besides what I've already talked about with the progression. You want to focus on getting good at packing your ruck and seeing kind of like what you like. You want to familiarize yourself with the ruck that you're going to be using at selection. You don't have to do every single training session. I've talked about this quite a bit. You don't have to do every session with the exact ruck you're going to be at selection with, but you at least want to familiarize yourself with how it fits, your preferred settings, like where you like to put everything on that ruck, how you like to fit it, whether you like the waist strap or not the waist strap or a little bit of both. That's my preference, is going back and forth. And you just want to familiarize yourself with it. Once you've done that, you don't necessarily have to use that ruck anymore. And I would recommend potentially not using that ruck too much when you're this far out, if it's a molly, because anyone who's had a molly for a while, you know that the strap fasteners wear down and they're a pain in the ass to fix all the time. And I would rather go to selection with that ruck fresh. So it's not just, you're not just cinching down your straps every couple steps. Believe me, I've been there. Not at selection, but I've been there in other parts of the Q course. It's not fun. It's just really annoying. So once you get a good feel for it, you could switch to something like a ruck trainer, or you could have a backup ruck. What I did for my CAG selection prep is I just used my Tactical Tailor Malice Pack. And never once at selection when I got at Molly was I like, oh man, I wish I had used a different ruck, or I wish I used the Molly. It just doesn't make that big of a difference. But I was also, keep in mind, very familiar with that Molly. So it wasn't a brand new thing to me, and I knew how to pack it. They actually show you how to pack it there. And it wasn't a huge deal. So you can use a ruck trainer if you want little pegs coming off. It's really up to you. Just get familiar with packing your ruck, how it fits, and rucking and progressing over time. But you don't have to get super into the details. And lastly here, in this 12 to 6 months out phase, you want to focus on a little bit of cross training. And you don't necessarily have to get super specific with this cross training. And what do I mean by that? There are certain types of non-impact or low impact cardio that are a little bit more, that have more carryover to rucking ability. For example, incline walking, Stairmaster, and as I mentioned earlier, the long walk with a sled attached to you. You don't have to worry too much about being super specific here. If you like biking, if you like rowing, if you like swimming, if you like a multitude of those different things, not a huge deal. You can definitely do those. How often? For most people, at least once a week. Maybe if you kind of struggle with running recovery or running B2 up quite a bit, maybe twice a week, maybe even 3 times a week, some weeks. Or for some people, if you're already a pretty solid runner and you recover well, you may do cross training every other week, or maybe 3 times a month. Every 10 days, you might do a cross training session, depending on how you split your training up. It's kind of up to you, but I definitely would consider it, because if all you're doing is running and rucking, believe me, I've been there, you are potentially going to run into recovery issues or overuse injury issues, and you're just better off getting some aerobic development from other forms of conditioning. So that's what you want to consider. And one last thing I want to cover before we hop into the next phase is almost every single client that I've ever had sign on with me and we do their assessment week, they come back with, when we kind of recap the assessment week, we talk about it, they say, wow, rucking fast, walking fast with a ruck on is super uncomfortable. That was miserable. Am I going to have to do that like every week? And I say, yeah, you are, because of course it's going to be uncomfortable your first time walking as fast as you can with a ruck on. I would bet that unless you've been listening to me for a really long time and you've heard me talk about this before, but I would bet most people watching or listening to this have never tried to walk as fast as they can with a ruck on as part of training and continuously actually done it until they got better at it. And anything you try, especially an uncomfortable activity like rucking, is, like I said, just going to be uncomfortable regardless. When you try something new and novel, your body's not used to it. Of course, it's not going to feel comfortable. But like I said, guess how you make yourself more comfortable? By doing it. So consider that. You're probably going to feel that. You're probably going to think that. You're probably going to maybe be like, ooh, maybe I should do some trotting. Maybe I should do some shuffling. Maybe I can kind of cheat the system. I can start doing my specific phase a little early during my base phase. I'll get away with it. And yeah, you probably can. Some people can. I ruck ran way, way, way more often than what I recommend people do before I knew any better, and I got away with it. But just because you can get away with something doesn't necessarily mean it's worth it, because you don't have to ruck run at all when you're 6 months out to 12 months out, and you can still put up your absolute best times 6 months from now when you finish this phase at selection. And I'm going to tell you how here in the next couple. But just remember that no complaints, just be consistent and continue moving forward. And over time, you'll get more used to the discomfort. It won't necessarily get less uncomfortable. You'll just get more used to it. And so you'll perceive it as less uncomfortable. So let's hop into 3 months out to 6 months out, or 6 months out to 3 months out, whatever you want to call it. This right here is your prime time for running gains. This is especially the case if you're going to something like RASP or SFAS or MARSOC, where they do quite a bit of similar stuff like they do at SFAS. You have to be good at running and rucking. I say those specifically and not delta selection, because delta selection is not really all that run dominant. You just really want to be good at rucking. You got to run fast once, but that's about it. So those specific selections, you really want to focus on getting really, really good at running specifically during this phase. A lot of people hit me up and ask me why my SFAS program doesn't have a lot of running in it. It does not have very high run volume. It only has 2 runs a week. They're both speed. One's a tempo work. One is repeats. And that is because the best thing you can possibly do is get good at running before you get into your specific prep. That way you are able to focus on all the different variables that you're going to have to be training for during your last few months. So this is your prime time for run gains, and it's your prime time to get a little more used to rucking. So I'll talk about specifics here. Let's go. Running. How often should you run? Probably, if you're a little worse at running, you need a little bit more work, probably 5 days a week. Maybe start at 4, maybe go up to 5. If you're already a pretty solid runner, you can be fine with like 3 days a week. Some people too, I like to suggest at least 3. And this is when you can start also doing some speed work. You can do some tempo work. This is going to be a little less specific. Like, you're not really worried about doing speed work at exactly your 5-mile pace or exactly your 2-mile pace. You're not worried about doing tempo work at like exactly a certain pace. That comes later in the 3 to 6 months out, the 3 months out. Right now, you are just focusing on expanding your base. So you're still going to do long runs, but you're also going to add in some tempo work. You're also going to add in some speed work, and it's going to be 400s, 200s, 800s, 1 mile. And you're probably, for most people, focusing mostly on RPE over exact paces at this point, because later down the road, you're going to need to be able to run based off RPE, because guess what? You're not going to have a watch telling you exactly how fast you're going or how far you've gone when you're at selection. You're not going to have a watch, period. So you're going to have to run purely off feel. It's a great time to learn it. And also, because it's less specific, you're not running at specific pacing right here because you're so far out. It's the support phase. It doesn't matter if you go a little bit too slow or a little bit too fast. Most people are going to go a little too fast. And that's just kind of something you learn. But also just remember, like repeats, guess what? They're called repeats for a reason, so you can repeat them. So if you go all out on the first one and you don't rest long enough, or you just go too hard and it doesn't matter how long you rest, you're not going to be able to repeat for, say, 12 400s or 8 400s. You're going to get slower and slower and slower each one. It's going to be super fatiguing, not very beneficial, not very stimulative. So remember that. Same with tempo work. If you're finishing your tempo run and you couldn't run another 200 meters at that pace, you're going too hard. If you could run maybe double that time, or at least like another 10 to 15 minutes, then you're doing pretty well. And this is out further away. It's not quite specific phase yet, which I'll talk about here in a bit. As far as frequency, you don't have to do speed and tempo every single week. And I would not recommend doing speed and tempo every single week. I would prioritize tempo a little bit more than speed during this phase, because it's a little bit lower intensity and it's less fatiguing and it beats you up less. But something like 3 tempo sessions in a month. So maybe a tempo every 10 days, or you could do 3 weeks on, 1 week off tempo. I like doing that anyway, regardless. Even if you are in a specific phase, I like taking at least a periodic day or week off from speed work. But as far as speed work, maybe every other week, or maybe for some people 3 speed sessions in a month. And the reason being is because those are very, very high fatigue, and they're definitely stimulative, but they're also high fatigue, and you don't necessarily have to be just running yourself into the ground at this point. When you get closer to selection, I'll talk about it. That's when you want to do close to weekly speed and tempo work, because you're peaking, as opposed to right now, you're not peaking. You're in your support phase before you get into your specific phase or your peaking phase. As for lifting, probably 3 days a week for almost everyone. If you still are very, very weak and maybe you're really good at running and really good at rucking, you can definitely do 4 days per week. You can do that upper lower split. But for most people, it should be about 3. That way you have plenty of recovery reserves to spend on rucking, running, and actually recovering from all of your training. If you're doing some sort of crazy 5-6 day per week split, it's probably just going to be excessive unless you're a recovery beast. But even if you are, I would spend your recovery reserves at this point on something different, like improving your running or rucking. And you can make incredible gains on 3 lifts per week if you're doing the right things. If you're not doing the right things, you could train however many days a week you want, and it's not going to go very well for you. But really the only difference here is if specifically you're going to a selection that involves carries like SFAS or MARSOC, is you're going to start doing a little bit more carries. And for carries, this is when I like to go a little heavier than what I'll be doing at selection. So most of the carries you're going to do at selection, at SFAS at least, are like 45 to 55 pounds. Water cans, ammo cans, things like that. So of course, as you get closer, you want to be more specific, but this far out is when you can kind of build like pure carrying strength, a little bit of a strength endurance, but more so strength. So this is when you want to go a little heavier and shorter, because carries, if you're going really heavy with carries and you're also going like forever, you're just doing like a carry endurance session with 100 pounds in each hand or 120 pounds in each hand, whatever it is, it's going to be very fatiguing and it's going to beat you up. It's very axial load dominant and it's very nervous system fatiguing. Doing a lot of grip work will fatigue the shit out of your nervous system if you don't do it right, or if you just go too hard, or you use way too much weight, you do it too frequently, whatever it is. So just consider that. But you can also, if you're weaker at calisthenics, the specific calisthenics like hand release push-ups, pull-ups, and things like that, you can consider doing that, a little bit more of that during this phase, because when you go into your next phase, probably at the end of this support phase, going into your next phase, you kind of want to see where you're at with your push-ups, your pull-ups, your plank, and whatnot. So maybe do a little bit more of that during this phase, but you don't necessarily have to do it every single time you lift. Generally, in the last couple months before going, it's probably a good idea to do calisthenics at least twice a week. For some people, maybe 3, some people even 4, like a greasing the groove type thing. If you have like one thing that's a lot more weak than other calisthenics. Focus here should be similar rep ranges, same body parts. If you have like a weak body part, you can focus a little bit more on that. If you have a weak lift, you can focus more on that. You really want to choose very joint healthy lifts that don't bang you up too much, that don't fatigue the hell out of you. And I've talked about this any number of times, but they don't have to be the barbell, squat, bench, and deadlift, power clean, and rows, and overhead press, all with a barbell. They can be a multitude of different things. Again, you're focused on the movement patterns and progressive overload. You're not focusing on some random lift that's arbitrary in the context of selection that you're not going to be tested on at selection just because you heard other people say that it's important to squat this much, bench this much, deadlift this much. It's not. You could never do any of those lifts and still make it. I promise you. Or you could be really weak like I was on those lifts and still make it. As long as you're strong at the right things. Carrying, calisthenics, carrying a ruck. As for rucking, you probably want to up it to at least once a week, maybe 5 rucks a month. Maybe for some people, if you're weaker at rucking and or you have really good recovery, you can consider doing 6 a month. So maybe 1 week you do 2, 1 week 1, next week 2, next week 1, or maybe once per month you do 2 rucks and the rest of the week you do 1. Or if you're pretty solid at rucking, you're feeling pretty confident with it, you're already walking, say like 14-minute walking pace, you probably only need 1 ruck per week at this stage. And this is when you can start adding a little bit of weight, 45 pounds, maybe up to 55 pounds. I would not recommend going higher than 55 pounds at this time. I barely would recommend doing that at all, but at this time, you don't need to. And again, wouldn't recommend doing frequent ruck trotting, but this is a period when you can start considering doing a little bit more ruck trotting. And that doesn't mean like you do your 4 rucks and then you go for your 5th ruck of the month and it's just trotting the entire time, or trotting for every flat and every downhill. No, it's just little bouts of trotting. Maybe say you're doing a 90-minute ruck. First 10 minutes, walk only. Last 10 minutes, walk only. For every 10 minutes in between there, say you do 2 out of 10 minutes where you're doing some trotting for all those 10 minutes. So that's probably 14 to 16 minutes total of maybe 7 to 8 rounds of 2 minutes of trotting. And at this time too, this is another nuance that is very important to discuss. When you're doing these trotting bouts, or if you do them, you don't necessarily have to, but if you are kind of introducing in as you get closer to that 3-month out mark, I highly suggest only trotting on flats and slight inclines, not super steep inclines, but slight inclines and flats, not trotting downhill. Because trotting downhill, although you definitely will do that next phase, and you'll do that a lot when you're getting tested on your rucks, testing versus training, when you're this far out, ruck running downhill is just going to beat you up. Going downhill, you go faster, it's higher impact because your foot is landing below the running surface, and it is just a lot more stressful on the knees as well as the soft tissue, connective tissue of the legs, and it's just not worth the squeeze at this point. Don't worry, we'll get into it because we do have to make those adaptations a little bit later. As for cross training, this is when you probably want to do once a week, maybe every other week, depending on the person. You can start considering getting a little bit more specific here. So, maybe you do one cross training session that's more general, whether it's a row or bike or swim, whatever you kind of prefer. And then maybe you do another one where you are doing incline walking, not with a ruck on, just incline walking at a pretty steep incline. Or you do Stairmaster or maybe Jacob's Ladder. Those are a little bit more specific towards rucking. Or like I said, you could do the sled work where you just drag the sled for a while. So that's what you want to consider for this phase. And that brings us to the end of the support phase. So we are now crunch time, 3 months out. This is selection specific prep, selection specific train up to show up as ready to smash rucks as you possibly can. Of course, I'm going to talk about other things because you're going to have to be good at other things too, but selection is a mostly ruck dominant thing. And a lot of people, going back to what I was kind of talking about earlier with the either leisure walking or running, like no in between, not practicing fast walking. A lot of people mess this up here because they practice ruck running for like gait week where they're going to have to go really fast, and they don't do a lot of other rucking. They don't spend a lot of time just walking with a ruck on at various different speeds, at fast speeds, at nice, easy speeds. And although you have to be fast enough at rucking to get to week 2 and week 3, you got to get through gait week by putting up good ruck times as well as other things. Most of the rucking that you're going to do at selection is going to be walking. You're going to be walking during land nav. You're going to be walking during team week. So the vast majority of time you're wearing a ruck, you're either going to be standing still is another one too. You're either going to be standing still or walking. So definitely remember that. Don't just practice rucking as fast as you possibly can, although we will do some of that during this phase. So again, this is 3 months out. For most people, 2 full body lifts and 1 calisthenics day, or calisthenics strongman combo where you do a bunch of strongman stuff like carries, sled drags, sandbag work, odd object carries, and so on and so forth. That's going to prep you for the CRA as well as, more importantly, team week. Lift, I would do full body, maybe something like Monday, Thursday, or Monday, Wednesday. Maybe you do Monday, Wednesday, full body, and then Friday you do your calisthenics and carries day. That's what I do with most of my clients, and it works out really well. You don't necessarily, even if you are not all that strong, you don't necessarily have to lift any more than 3 days per week, but I would say even 2 days per week. You can get really good results on that split right there if you are putting a lot of intent behind your lifts. I will say if you are really weak and you're already really good at running and rucking for whatever reason, maybe you got a good endurance background or something like that, and somehow you're also good at rucking, yeah, you probably can get away with 3 days per week, maybe 4, but for most people, the vast majority of people, if you're lifting 4 days a week going into selection, you're just kind of, your priorities are backwards. I always say this, selection's an endurance event with a strength component, not the other way around. So just consider that. When you're lifting, you also want to consider a lot more specific calisthenics. You also want to consider lower volume, higher intensity. So you don't want to be doing tons of extra sets, tons of extra reps. Honestly, you're just going for a stimulus, progressive overload. Even if you just maintain your strength throughout this time, that's totally fine. You want to pick maybe 5 or 6 lifts to do on day 1, 5 or 6 lifts to do on day 2. And they should be the big movement patterns, and they should not be anything super crazy or complicated. You want to consider also a little bit less spinal loading during this time, or axial loading, because you're going to have your ruck on a lot. You're going to be carrying things a lot. And if you're doing everything with a barbell, like barbell deadlifts, barbell front squats, barbell back squats, barbell RDLs, like barbell rows, that is going to potentially add up to just being a lot of spinal load. And the more you load your spine, it's a very good thing. You want to adapt to it. But also, if you're doing it needlessly, when you could otherwise be doing like a belt squat, or you could be doing a single leg RDL, that's a lot less spinal loading than like a heavy ass deadlift. That's going to allow you to limit your fatigue, your overall general fatigue. Spinal loading is like a separate source of fatigue beyond like muscular fatigue, nervous system fatigue, mental fatigue that I talk about all the time. So consider that too. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do any. You can absolutely do some, but it should be like maybe 1 day of lifting, you do a non-spinal loaded squat. So maybe a single leg squat or a belt squat. And then that day you can do a deadlift or deadlift variation. That's your axial loading for that day. And then maybe the next day you do a axial loaded squat and a non-axial loaded hinge, like a 45-degree back raise or a hip thrust or something like that. That's not a hinge, but it still works similar muscles. So that's just a consideration that not a lot of people talk about. I do have an old video that I can link to in the description where I talk about how to set up your lifting template going into selection. But anyway, you just want to consider that. And oh, and as for running, we got a little out of order. So usually I talk about running first, then lifting, but we'll talk running second. So running, you want to consider just doing very specific things. Of course, if you're still a weaker runner, you want to maybe consider doing 3 or 4 runs a week, maybe 1 ruck some weeks, 2 rucks other weeks. If you're already pretty damn good at running because you did the right things in the previous phase, then you can consider maybe running twice a week, maybe 3 times per week, or maybe twice one week, 3 times the next week, something similar to that. And you want to really consider running around your goal paces. So you're going to run somewhere around 2 miles, somewhere around 4 miles, somewhere around 6 or 7 miles. No one really knows, but you want to be doing some tempo work for sure. You can use your 5 mile pace. You can hit a 5 mile time trial before this phase and see where you're at and use that pace to pace your tempo runs. And then you can probably do a 2 mile run, a 2 mile time trial, and determine your goal paces based off that. And that's how you do your run training. So can you do long runs? Yeah, you absolutely can, especially if you're already really good at rucking. But I would not do a really long ruck with running in it, which I'll talk about ruck training here in a second. But I wouldn't do that plus a long run every single week. That's just a little bit too much. But that doesn't mean you can't run 3 times per week. You could do an easy, moderate run if you need a little bit more work on your running. So now let's talk rucking. All right, so this is when the rucking specificity shines. Generally speaking, for most people, unless you're very weak at rucking, I would recommend twice a week. Earlier in the week, do something a little heavier, 50, 55 pounds, maybe put 60 to 65 pounds on your back once in a while just to see how it feels. And you're doing this ideally cross country some weeks. So you could either do land nav practice or you could walk in a similar environment to land nav out in the woods, ups and downs. If you don't have access to that, not a huge deal. You can do it on roads or ideally some sort of dirt road so it's not quite as impactful. Or you could do it on trails, whatever you have access to kind of. But you do want a little bit of a change in elevation. Now, if you're prepping for SFAS, I don't really know what RASP looks like. It's probably pretty similar to Camp McCall, but it's not crazy elevation changes. It's slight rolling hills. That's really the main thing you need to mostly be focusing on. If you live somewhere where it's really hilly, it's not the end of the world, but it's a little bit less specific. And, it's not like if you don't live there, you're fucked because you are not going to be good enough at going up hills. As long as you expose yourself to a little bit of rolling hills, you're probably going to be good to go. So that's 1 ruck per week, starting maybe 60 minutes and then going up to 2 hours, 2.5 hours, maybe even 3 hours for that session. That I would not consider that my long ruck necessarily for the week. The other ruck that you're going to be doing that week is going to be your long ruck. So say this is on a Saturday or a weekend day. This is like to replace from previous phases your long run. Again, similar terrain, definitely not off trail. Like you don't have to go do this through the woods or anything like that. This is kind of more prepping for gate week. So you want to expose yourself to a little bit of rolling hills, ideally not on pavement or mostly not on pavement, just because it's going to beat you up more and it's less specific to what you're going to see at selection. You're going to be on sand and dirt. This is when you can start incorporating a lot more ruck running. And generally, if you go back to the last phase when I talked about doing it for short periods of time, this is when you can start building on that. So maybe a couple rucks in the last phase, in the support phase, you ran or trotted 2 out of 10 minutes for 70 minutes total. So that's 14 minutes total. Next ruck, to start this phase, you can consider doing 3 minutes of running per 10 minutes, then 4 minutes. This ruck will continue to get a little longer. I personally like using time. You can use mileage if you want, kind of up to you. But this ruck should probably top off at 2.5, 3, maybe even a little bit more than 3 hours for some people. And again, it should have parts of the ruck where you do a little bit of trotting. Now, this is when downhill running comes into play with a ruck on. Your body needs to adapt to ruck running downhill, but not all that much. You're going to ruck run downhill a couple times during gate week. And if you don't do it at all in training, which usually people will train like they test and they'll do a ton of ruck running downhill, so they don't have to worry about this. But I wouldn't recommend doing that because it's just going to beat you up more, but you should do some. So I would start considering this around 7 to 8 weeks out. You do a little bit of ruck running downhill. Maybe the first time you ruck, you do 6 or 7 minutes total of ruck running downhill spread out in multiple different sections. Then maybe 4 to 5 weeks out, again, you're going to do some downhill running, this time 8 to 10 minutes. And then probably 2 weeks out, maybe 3 weeks out, right before you start your taper, you want to consider doing some more downhill running. So maybe 10 to 12 minutes. That way you're getting that exposure and you're able to adapt, but you're not doing it nearly as much. It's not going to beat you up nearly as much. It's going to be less fatiguing, less potentially injury promoting, but it's going to allow you to be prepared for it when you get there and you are doing your downhill portions, because when you're at selection, you want to take advantage of the downhills and use gravity and to go fast. That's beneficial, but again, different than testing. And if you haven't exposed yourself to that, it will beat you up. If you've ever run a race and you didn't do enough downhill running in preparation for it, this was me in my half marathon that I did a couple months ago. It just destroyed my quads because I had not done nearly enough downhill running. And although it's easy, yeah, you just kind of use gravity. It's fun. You're going fast, but it does destroy your quads if you're not used to it. But those adaptations don't take a lot. They happen quickly. Again, you're doing like 3 sessions where you do downhill running, a couple months out, a month and a half out, half a month out, give or take, and you're going to be good to go. So you want to consider that as well. Once or twice throughout this time, maybe throw 65 to 70 pounds in your ruck, not for the ruck run, but for the cross country ruck. For the ruck run, 45 to 55 pounds you don't have to go any higher than 55 pounds. Yes, that's less than the ruck is going to weigh at selection, but there's a difference between testing and training. If you are loading up 65, 75, 80 pounds, I've heard of people, I do all my ruck training with 80 pounds. You are not getting extra benefits from that. You're going to get used to using 80 pounds, but also it's just going to beat you up unnecessarily. Like, it's totally unnecessary. If you can smash rucks with 55 pounds or even 50 pounds on your back, you're going to be totally fine when it's 8 pounds more than that, or 7 pounds more than that, or 9 pounds, whatever it is. I promise you're going to be okay, especially if you do everything else right. You train hard and you have a little bit of mental fortitude. And most importantly, when you keep the ruck a little bit lighter, it also keeps you available. It does not potentially injure you or develop an overuse injury. Cross training, this is very situation dependent, person dependent. Some people can benefit from a cross training session per week. Some people maybe every other week. Some people maybe like once a month. You have a non-running week or a minimal running week where you do more cross training. And on that note also, I mentioned doing speed work and I mentioned doing tempo work. Every 3, 4, 5 weeks, depending on the person, depending on how you're feeling, depending on your progress, consider doing a non-speed week. You should not be doing 3 straight months of speed work and tempo work every single week. Even high-level runners, elite runners, don't do that. So listen to your body, and even if your body is telling you that you feel good and it's been 5, 6, 7 weeks since you last skipped a speed session or did something different like an easy run or a non-impact session instead of that speed session, consider doing it. Keep yourself available so that you show up ready to crush. So that wraps up the last couple of months before you go. I have another video where I talk about tapering that I will link in the description. I'm not going to talk about a complete taper here because that would take another 30 minutes, but check that video out if you want to learn about tapering. What I will talk about is all the non-rucking things and all the non-training things that are still going to play a role. Recovery, what you do outside of training, is massive. And I've talked about this thousands of times in other episodes, so I'm just going to brush over it. But none of this is really going to do much if you're not sleeping well, if you're not eating well, if you're not fueling well. Huge considerations for maximum performance and recovery and staying injury-free. When you are sleep deprived and or if you are underfed and or if you're underhydrated or poorly hydrated, like you're just sipping water the entire time, you don't have any electrolytes, you don't bring any sort of intra-workout fuel, or you don't really eat anything pre-workout, or you're just not eating well in general or eating enough calories in general, you are way more susceptible to acute injuries as well as overuse injuries. Your body's just not in a state to perform well and also recover well and also heal well from all of the stressors you're going to be putting yourself under, which this is a very stressful process. If you do it the way that I just broke it down, it's less stressful, but still those last few months before you go are highly stressful on the joints, on the nervous system, mentally stressful. You're going to be mentally stressed about your training, and you're also going to be mentally stressed about the fact that you're about to go to selection and you don't know what your fate's going to be. You don't know if you're going to show up and make it or not, or if something bad's going to happen. That's normal, but also it's stressors. The best way to kind of mitigate that is to A, sleep well, eat really well, hydrate really well, and find some sort of stress mitigation technique that you enjoy, that you can stick to, that you can do consistently, that is not training. So of course, training can be a stress reliever for sure. People who generally train consistently are generally less stressed than people who don't. But training is a stressor. And if that's your only stress mitigation technique, just adding more stress to try and manage your stress, you might temporarily feel better, but you have to consider something different, like breath work or walks in nature or talking to a therapist or hanging out with people that make you laugh or watching comedy or something like that, that just kind of calms you down. You're not really thinking about, I got selection coming up, or you're just able to decompress and separate yourself from training. You make all the progress that you're training for, all the adaptations, all of the gains are made outside of training, not training. A lot of people think, especially type A guys that are prepping for selection, however much stress I can possibly handle, that's how much I should do. That's how much I should train in my prep. Because if I just subject myself to crazy, crazy high levels of physical stress, mental stress, it's going to feel easier when I get to selection. And that's not really how it works. Yes, your training should be stressful. It should challenge you. But stress plus rest equals fitness, not stress plus more stress equals fitness. Remember that. It's going to save you. And you are not weak or uncool if you do breath work or meditation or walks in nature or whatever your preferred. You pet your dog and you give your dog a belly rub. That is not weak. That is strong and smart. That's going to help you recover. It's going to help you perform better, and it's going to help you stay or at least mitigate your injury risk. And you're going to show up and go smash. So hopefully you guys found some value in that. Hopefully you guys enjoyed that. If you have questions, comments, concerns, or if you want to learn about something specific, you want me to break down part of that in detail in a future episode or a future YouTube video or a future post, let me know in the comments. You can now make comments, by the way, on Spotify. And I don't think you can on Apple, but Spotify, you can make comments. I can't reply directly to you, by the way. I look at the comments. I know a couple people have left comments recently, and I appreciate that. I separately, in a different comment, have to reply. I haven't figured out if you can actually reply to the comment or tag the person or anything yet. But either way, I appreciate it. And of course, on YouTube, if you leave me a comment or question, I will do my very best to get back to you. And thank you guys very much for listening. I will be back soon with another episode. Till then, Terminator out.